All right, today's slides are to help us introduce the concept of homeostasis and talk about the skin in homeostasis. So here we have some keywords and objectives and a picture that's actually a microscopic photograph of the skin. The epidermis is the free surface on top there with layers of cells, and below it is the dermis. And there labeled are some structures in the dermis: hair follicles, which give rise to hair; sebaceous glands, which produce sebum, an oily fluid that waterproofs the skin and hair; and then the sweat glands, which produces a fluid that evaporates off the skin and carries with it excess heat. Today we're going to describe the functions of the skin, and in particular how homeostasis and negative feedback control systems work, and how the skin participates in body temperature regulation, and that's one of those systems. Last time we introduced tissues, which are simply groups of cells that appear relatively similar, are in a similar location, and work together to perform a single function. There are 4 basic types of tissues listed there, but each type of tissue, there are many subtypes. And so here is a picture of simple columnar epithelium. Okay, there's one layer of column-shaped cells between the basement membrane and the surface. Everything in the human body is made out of tissues. Okay, but tissues don't do it by themselves. Individual tissues generally work in combination with other tissues to form organs. The simplest organs are membranes, which are usually 2 or more tissues together to line some sort of cavity or surface. We had mucous membranes, synovial membranes, serous membranes, and then the cutaneous membrane, which is really just the skin. Okay, and the skin is an organ then. It's a thin but a very large organ, and the upper layer of the skin is called the epidermis, and it's made out of an epithelial tissue, and the lower layer of the skin is called the dermis. Then in the dermis there are not only connective tissue fibers and cells, fibroblasts, but there's also other structures like glands and nerve cells and blood vessels and hair and things like that. Then underneath the skin is the hypodermis, a layer of fat or loose connective tissue. So we introduced those ideas of skin structure and tissues last time. Today we really want to talk about the functions of the skin, or the skin's physiology. The skin, these layers of the skin and structures in the skin work together to perform some specific functions, including the protection of the body from dehydration, the protection from abrasion, infection, and damage by ultraviolet light. The skin also synthesizes vitamin D. It detects things like temperature and touch and pain, and so it's involved in sensation. And in a few instances, its communication occurs through the skin. And then probably the most important one for us is that it's involved in the regulation of body temperature. Okay, let's go into some of these in a little more detail. First, a lot of the function of the skin is really functions of the epidermis. The cells we learned about before that make up that piled layer of cells, those are the keratinocytes, and they fill up with a tough protein called keratin. That protein, it seals in the moisture of the skin, and it's covered. The cells of the upper part of the skin are covered with sebum, an oily secretion from the sebaceous gland, and that makes that epidermis pretty watertight. And so it prevents water loss. Our skin is fairly effective at that. And because those upper layers of the skin have this keratin in them, and it's made up of mostly dead cells, it protects us from abrasion and from infection. And even once organisms enter the skin contains lots of immune cells, and so it has a strong capacity to fight off organisms even once they invade. In addition, the upper layer of the skin, the epidermis, contains scattered melanocytes. These are slightly larger cells that sit low down in the epidermis, and they make a pigment, melanin, that gives the skin a brownish or black color depending on how much is present. Melanocytes make the pigment, and then they can pass it on to keratinocytes. And so all the cells of the skin will take on that coloring. And the purpose of melanin is melanin prevents ultraviolet light from penetrating down into the layers of the skin where there are cells dividing and might be vulnerable to mutation. And particularly ultraviolet light, a type of light that's found in sunlight or in tanning beds, that can cause damage to the DNA of skin cells and so can lead to several different types of cancer. And the skin produces this melanin to protect these underlying cells. And so in some people, that melanin is produced all the time. In other people, it's only produced after exposure to the sun, and so it can be induced. But the vast majority of people make melanin, and it's the same in all different people. It's just how active are their cells, how much melanin do they make. And so it protects them from ultraviolet light. Then in the dermis, shown here kind of below that top layer, the dermis contains lots of structures, and some of these structures are involved in sensation and communication. Particularly, there are receptors, sensory cells called Pacinian corpuscles. The base of hair follicles have nerve cells attached to them, and these things can sense touch, pressure. Some of them will sense pain. And the flow of blood there in the skin can also be kind of a communication signal. We blush. For people with light-colored skin, we blush when we're embarrassed, when we're shamed, things like that. Then the other big structures in the skin that have important functions in the function of the skin are the sweat glands and the dermal blood vessels. The sweat glands and the blood vessels really help us control the loss of heat through the skin. Okay, when the sweat glands become more active, they produce a watery fluid that is deposited on the surface of the skin. And when that evaporates, that carries a lot of heat with it. Likewise, when we're hot, the blood vessels in the skin open up or dilate, and extra blood flows to the skin. And heat then from that's carried by that blood can then be lost to the environment. On the other hand, when we're cold, just the opposite can happen. The sweat glands become less active, and the dermal blood vessels are more likely to be closed, and so less heat gets lost through the skin. Whoops, where did I went? I went the wrong way there. Okay, skin and temperature. Okay, so the skin and temperature, the sweat glands and the blood flow through the dermis of the skin. This is all coordinated. It doesn't just happen kind of naturally. There's a center in the brain called the hypothalamus, and this center of the brain is called a control center. And sensory receptors from blood vessels and from the skin signal this center in the brain, and so these sensors are giving information to this control center that determines if we are too hot or too cold. If that control center, comparing the incoming information, decides that we're too hot, it'll send signals to the skin via nerves to make those blood vessels take more blood, so hot blood flows to the skin where it can lose heat, and the sweat glands can start producing more sweat, and this will increase temperature loss. If, on the other hand, the hypothalamus decides, hey, this sensory input says it's too cold, it reduces the amount of blood flowing to the skin, so that keeps the warm body in deeper areas, and it cuts off the sweating. This kind of series of events is typical of homeostasis, and this is the body's tendency to maintain a stable internal environment. That environment is not constant, it's not at equilibrium, but it fluctuates around a set point. And so these minor fluctuations tend to be relatively small, and this allows the cells of the body to enjoy conditions that are very good for their normal function. The type of system that does this is referred to as a negative feedback system, and these systems detect change from a set point and initiate action to oppose the change. So some stimulus activates the sensor then activates the control center, or sends a message to the control center, who compares the incoming sensory information with a set point, and that control center can activate effectors, and the effectors can oppose the change. And so, in the case of body temperature, the sensory receptors alert the hypothalamus when anytime body temperature deviates too far from about 37 degrees Celsius. Okay, if body temperature is high above 37 degrees Celsius, the hypothalamus sends messages to the nerve cells that are going to activate sweat glands and increase the flow of blood to the skin, and so that will get rid of heat. On the other hand, if body temperature falls too low, it does the opposite thing. It reduces the input going to the sweat glands, so they start producing less sweat. It reduces the flow of blood to the dermal blood vessels, so the skin gets cool and the warm blood stays near the cold, or near the core of the body. And this is really important. Your body is trying to maintain a core temperature, and this core temperature is around your heart, your lungs, some internal organs like the kidneys and digestive tract and brain. It really wants to maintain those things at a very close to that set point of 37 degrees. But it's willing, the body and the control center is willing to allow the skin temperature to fluctuate in order to maintain that core temperature. And if we're really having trouble maintaining our core temperature, the body may let the feet or the hands, the temperature in that whole limb drop. And other organs can be involved in temperature regulation. And so, for instance, if body temperature falls far enough below normal, away from that 37 degrees centigrade, the control center can activate the muscles to cause the muscles to contract to produce heat. This is shivering. And so the muscles can be involved. Other organs can become involved as well, like the liver, just producing more and more heat. And so this is a really important way that the body can coordinate this. And it's not just temperature that is maintained near a set point. The body maintains water levels, levels of glucose, amino acids, iron, all sorts of nutrients. It maintains blood pressure near a set point. It maintains all sorts of variables close to a set point, and it does this usually by negative feedback. And so very often when we find a disease condition, often the negative feedback control has broken down. Okay, so that's a very short presentation on homeostasis and negative feedback, but it's a really important concept. It appears over and over again in physiology, the function of the human body. Many organ systems are involved in maintaining homeostasis. Okay, so just to summarize here, the skin is an organ, and like most organs, it has multiple tissues, and these tissues cooperate to perform functions. That's physiology. And one of the ways they do this is through homeostasis of body temperature, and usually this is with negative feedback. So you have multiple organs involved: the skin, the brain, the muscles, sometimes the liver, the heart through pumping blood, and the blood vessels. All these things are involved, are really an important concept.